And I'll probably just say, I'll probably be on the incident number. I'll probably photograph it. I don't know.
For free. Yep, you heard that right. Entire year.
Hi, everybody. We'll get started here in probably a minute. So a lot of people are still jumping on here. All right, Chris, what do you say? You want to kick us off?
Yeah, sounds good. Ready when you are, Shane.
I'm ready. Looks like things are slowing down in terms of people in the waiting room.
Okay, great. We'll get started then. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the 2023 PyreCast webinar. We're really happy and excited to have you here and are looking forward to sharing some of the things we've been working on with you. And I wanted to just give a little bit of background about the California Energy Commission EPIC, or Electric Program Investment Charge, which is the funder for this particular project. This EPIC program is intended to help improve the resiliency of the electrical grid in California. But as I'll show here shortly, I think there's a lot of other ratepayer benefits from this project in particular. And I wanted to start by acknowledging and thanking the PyreCast team. This is really an interdisciplinary group, multifaceted talents ranging from fire behavior analysts to software engineers, fire protection engineer, and IT specializations and so on. And really a lot of what I'm going to show is the work of others. I'm just lucky enough to be able to get to present it. So thank you, PyreCast team. Some logistics: as you joined this meeting, you were probably greeted with a notice saying that's being recorded. That will be posted to pyregence.org/media at a later date. Please keep yourself muted. I hate to be the annoying person saying that, but we've all been in meetings where people come off mute, so just try to be cognizant of that. And during the webinar, feel free to post questions in the chat. Other members of our team are standing by to do their best to answer your questions in a timely manner. And then at the end, we will have a discussion, kind of a roundtable discussion, Q&A. And during that, feel free to use the raise hand function to ask a question. So I mentioned the CEC EPIC program that is funding this work. This is really quite a large project. It has 4 main working groups led by different experts in the field. And today, we're only going to be talking about one of those working groups, work group 3, which is the short-term forecast, or PyreCast, as it's come to be called. When this grant was awarded back in 2019, we came up with a moniker for the consortium called Pyregence. This is the kind of overarching organization that keeps these teams together and working under this particular project. And that's where the name PyreCast comes from. It's the Pyregence forecast tool. So outline is quite brief, actually. The first part, which is going to take up most of the time here, is intro and usage to the PyreCast forecast tool. And I think that's what most folks are interested in. After that, we're going to go into a little bit of sort of what's under the hood, how you can access the underlying software and data, and talk about some of the ongoing and upcoming research and development activities, and then finish up with a question and answer session. So as I said, most of what I'll be doing is just a demo of the tool. And as I go through this, if there are questions, please drop them into the chat. So to access the tool, you go to pyrecast.org, pyrecast.org, and you will be greeted with this disclaimer. What this disclaimer says is that this is an experimental fire forecast tool. It's a work in progress. It's in a beta testing phase. And you can see the terms of use and privacy policy down at the end. So once you click accept, you will see a map very similar to this. And I want to just go through some of the, the basic navigation. So starting in the lower left, you can select different.
Hey Chris, I think we're still just seeing the presentation itself and not the actual PyreCast window.
Okay.
I'm seeing the PyreCast window. I think you might be lagging, Oliver.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I can see the interface.
Okay,
right,
good. Thank
my
you.
issue then. Sorry.
Oliver's on dial-up. Okay, so lower left is where you select different base maps. So that was the street topo. This is satellite, and then here is satellite street. I like this particular base map because it has place marks, highways, things that we can orient ourselves with. Moving up from there, if you go up to live satellite, this is the current GOES 16 image for the continental US. And what you can see is a lot of smoke coming down from fires in Canada that have been in the news, as well as smoke being generated by the multitude of fires in the northern part of California from the lightning bust a couple days back. Okay, this updates about every 5 minutes, and it's just meant to kind of show at a high level what's happening out there, especially as fire activity picks up. We can turn on satellite hotspot detections, both the MODIS and VIIRS sensors. So these are sensors on 4 different orbiting satellites, update or image an area approximately every 12 hours. And the way that this is stylized or legended is the hotter colors correspond to more recent detections, and the blue colors or the cooler colors correspond to older detections. So you see this little blue area up here. These are older detections on a fire that burned in Oregon called the Flat Fire. And what I can do is turn on the current year fire perimeter by selecting 2023 fire perimeters. You'll see the outline or the perimeter of the now largely contained Flat Fire in Oregon, and you can see the perimeters from the ongoing fires in Northern California. Now, these perimeters are typically from overflights, meaning infrared imaging on fixed wing aircraft. Sometimes they are hand sketches, sometimes they're just best guesses. And you'll see that some of these fires haven't been imaged yet. So Canyon and Elliott, for example, there is, of course, heat detection on it from satellites, but there has not, at least to the best of my knowledge, been an IR overflight on that particular fire or fires. And I'm going to just turn these off to avoid things getting too cluttered. And just moving up, one of the goals of this project is to forecast impacts to assets at risk. A very important asset at risk is, of course, structures. So if you toggle this structures box here, what you'll see is the location of structures. This is from the Microsoft or the Bing building footprints data set. And just kind of to zoom into a wildland urban interface area, you can see what that looks like when we toggle that on and off. So it's a real quick way, especially if you're looking at a fire forecast, to get an idea as this headed toward places where people work and live. Being funded by the California Energy Commission, we're of course interested in the resiliency of the electrical grid. And so if you click this transmission lines box, what you'll see is transmission lines. This is not distribution, which is what's in your neighborhood, typically bringing power to your house, but these are the higher voltage transmission lines that carry energy long distances. And this is from the Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data set, or HIFLD. This is all publicly available data. There's nothing proprietary or confidential in here. Nothing I'm going to show today is in any way proprietary or confidential. As I'll show a little bit later, in addition to using this to look at potential impacts from ongoing fires to the electrical grid, we are also using this data to ignite fires and model the spread of those fires into the future under forecasted conditions across a large part of the Western US. And that's really getting at public safety power shutoff, potential impacts from power line fires, and so on. Okay, so that's the kind of main navigation tools over here on the left. Going over to the right, and I've got to get the zoom window out of the way, you'll see another set of tools here. There's a simple tool to measure distance if you wanted to know maybe how far away is a particular fire from some power lines or something like that. You could say, all right, here's deep and upper, which is two fires that have burned together. And we pick one spot here down by Junction City. Distance between points is about 15 kilometers. So that can be used to just scale off some distances real quickly. The button above that is fire history. This is from 2000 to 2022. And there's a lot of fire history in California and elsewhere for that matter. It's a little busy. Let me turn off some of these other layers here to make it a little less busy. And you can see some of the recent fires that have impacted the Northern California Caldor fire in 2021, last year's mosquito fire. So this is a very useful for when you're looking at a fire forecast, understanding, is this fire about to spread into areas that have recently burned, or is this spreading through an area that hasn't burned in 20 or more years? Hide fire history, red flag warnings. If you toggle that or hit that red flag warning button, what this will do is show where there are red flag warnings in the US. And then if you wanted to get information about a particular red flag warning, you can select that polygon, hit click for more info, and it brings you over to NWS. I'm gonna have to back out of this page here. So in this case, in Montana, west winds 25 to 35 miles per hour with gusts up to 50. That's a pretty serious red flag warning with relative humidity in the teens. Okay. So let's toggle that off. And then one of, I think, perhaps my favorite feature is the camera tool that provides access to feeds from Alert Wildfire and Alert California. So we could go to Lake Tahoe, see what's going on there. Looks like a nice day up there, maybe some thunderstorms potentially moving in a little bit later. So there we are looking north toward Round Hill, looking across the lake. Yeah, looking like some thunderstorms potentially up there, starting to form. And here we are looking down toward Reno. So one of the kind of cool things about this is we've been looking at things in a 2D or overhead view, but there's also a three-dimensional terrain option where you can view the world in 3D, sort of like you might in Google Earth if you turn on the topography there. And so one of the ways to do that is you can click the zoom map to camera button. Let's do that. And so what this is going to do is try to line up the viewpoint from that camera with the map here. So here we are looking across Lake Tahoe. And this is particularly useful if there are ongoing fires, because you can actually look at in real time how the model is doing as far as forecasting the spread of a fire relative to where that fire is. I think one of the only fires that might be in view now, and it's not even particularly active, is the Coyote fire in San Diego County. So not a whole lot of activity on that fire that was ignited yesterday. Okay, so another thing or another area I'll point out, or I'll get into later, is if you look in the upper right corner here, there's a login button where you can log in, and what that does is expose certain options and functionality that the public users don't necessarily have access to. And so that is for utilities, access to their proprietary and confidential assets data. And for other users, including utilities, that is access to the match drop tool, which allows you to ignite fires at particular locations and model their spread. And I'll show some of that a little bit later. Okay, I want to call your attention to the top center panel here. You'll see we've got fuels, weather, risk, and active fires. The default landing page, at least during quote unquote fire season, is active fires. But I want to go into some of the fuels here. So I'm going to click on fuels. I'm going to make this full screen again. And some folks are very familiar with Landfire. Landfire is a federal program that was commissioned over 20 years ago to essentially develop the inputs that are needed for fire modeling in the US at a resolution of about 30 meters or 100 feet. And there are different versions of Landfire that include different disturbances, meaning fire, but also other disturbances such as tree mortality. And so the current version, which is what we're using in all the forecast, is Landfire 2.3.0, which is 2023 capable, meaning it has all disturbances from last year. But because it's a very time-intensive thing, it's rolled out sort of region by region. So this is the current extent of Landfire 2.3.0, the 2023 capable product. It's basically the Southwest comes first, and then the Northwest comes second or comes later, and then the rest of the US is filled in after that. So what we're doing for our forecasting is using a hybrid that plugs in Landfire 2.2.0, which is 2021 capable in the areas where there isn't coverage for Landfire, the 2023 capable product just yet. What you're looking at is each of these colors represents a different surface fuel model. That is a stylized representation of fuel load on the surface. And what you can see in these areas is scars, burn scars. So if I turn back on the fire history layer, for example, this is the mosquito fire last year that was put out by a rainstorm in early to mid-September. And what this is doing is essentially accounting for the fact that this area has burned and has a reduced fuel load due to a reduction in fuel from that that fire. So we can look at this not just in overhead view, but also in the 3D view, where this gives you a better idea of where the river canyons are, where the river bottoms are, how those canyons look, and so on. We could also, if I back out to here, look at some topo layers, slope, showing the slope in degrees. So a lot of these slopes are 30+ degrees. This is why this was a really challenging fire, and we were just fortuitous enough to get some moisture that really knocked it down. I want to show a couple other layers as well. Let me get back to the overhead view. I'm going to go to canopy cover and dial this opacity back a little bit. Now let's go to Placerville. So Placerville is an area relatively high risk from fires, wildland-urban interface fires, because there's fuel and there's a lot of structures. If I turn that structure layer back on, there's a lot of structures kind of interspersed throughout there. So this is showing the stock Landfire canopy cover product, 30-meter resolution. And I just wanted to show what some of the higher resolution products look like. If we go to the California Forest Observatory, and you see this is now 10-meter resolution, what you can see is that this is doing a much better job at capturing the distribution of, in this case, canopy cover in this wildland-urban interface area. And going back to the Landfire product, you can kind of see how that's a little coarse. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that a lot of the interest now is in modeling wildland-urban interface fires. And to do so with our current inputs, you know, we're doing an okay job, but I think we can do a better job with higher resolution inputs that are capable of better resolving some of the details of the fuel distribution in the wild and urban interface. So going back in time, we can look at fuels from different eras. So we've basically preloaded all of the stock land fire layers in there, and that allows you to go back and look at how fuels have changed over time, going back to about 2008. Okay, so that's the fuels tab. Really, the idea here is to just have everything in one place, so that if you want to see what the models are using, this is what it's using, and this can, you know, sometimes provide insight if you're seeing some strange behavior and want to maybe understand why is the model doing what it's doing. Moving to the right is weather, and let's zoom out. So what this is doing is pulling in operational weather models from the usual sources, so NWS, NOAA, NCEP, et cetera, and making them available in a way that is easy to query. So what I mean by that is we can drop a pin at any particular location. So let's see, I'm here in Auburn, so it's a little hot out there today, not quite as hot as it has been. And this is a forecast of the you know, temperature from the HER model in particular. Okay. We saw earlier there was some fire weather going on due to this red flag warning. Let's get that back up. And we can use this to maybe investigate what's happening up here. So we can look at some fire specific layers rather than just temperature, relative humidity, and things like that. And some of the fire weather layers that are in here are the Fosberg Fire Weather Index. I'm going to turn up the opacity here a little bit. Now let's go to what model should we use? Let's use the NAM. Okay, so we can select a particular area. And so here what we're seeing is Fosberg Fire Weather Index of about, let's go to where it's a little bit higher, about 55 or 60. So in general, with Fosberg above 50 for about 3 hours, that's of concern from a fire weather perspective. So seeing some decent Fosberg values. Another model that we can look at is, or another fire weather quantity that provides some insight, is the hot, dry, windy index. The hot, dry, windy index is similar to Fosberg. These are both fuel independent measures of potential fire spread. The hot, dry, windy index is probably a little more rigorous and fundamental because it uses vapor pressure deficit instead of relative humidity. The vapor pressure deficit is a better measure of the drying potential. And but you know, when you get up into about 400 to 500 for hot, dry, windy, that's also of concern. So we're definitely seeing some fire weather in the northern parts. You can also see you know, some flow through the Cascade Gaps here into central Washington and so on. In terms of wind gust, we can select wind gust here, see what we're dealing with. You know, over this higher elevations here, it looks like 45, maybe 50 miles per hour in some locations. And a lot of times this can make more sense intuitively if you look at things in kind of 3 dimensions. And here's a good example where you can see that a lot of these elevated wind gusts that we're seeing in the forecast is over this higher terrain. Okay, so big weather news this week is, I guess now officially, Hurricane Hillary, the first tropical storm warning that California, I think, has ever had, and the first time there's been a potential for hurricane landfall since World War II. And so one of the things you might want to look at is, well, how much rain are we going to get? Where's that forecast to go? So for that, I like to use the NBM, the National Blend of Models. And we can go to the accumulated precipitation. And I'm just going to drag this out to the end of the forecast, or later in the forecast at least. And so what you can see here is it's putting a good slug of moisture into Southern California, the Mojave and Sonoran Desert, Southern Nevada, including Las Vegas and the Spring Mountains. Forecast to see upwards of 2 inches of rain for this particular model. And the reason I'm pointing this out is you'll see this reflected in some of the fire model layers we'll talk about later, as well as some of the fire risk layers. And unfortunately, if we turn back on our ongoing fire layers, you can see it's really not currently forecast to get much moisture up here to these ongoing fires in Del Norte and Siskiyou counties. So we can't depend on Hurricane Hilary to put out these fires in Northern California. Okay, another cool thing that I like to look at, especially this time of year, is the smoke forecast, in this case from the HRRR, the High Resolution Rapid Refresh model. So that's what we're looking at here. And so what this is doing is pulling in essentially the fire intensity as measured by satellites and using that to create a smoke generation layer, which then goes into a smoke transport model and is used to model the evolution of smoke in space and time. So you can see in this case here, the HRRR is showing a lot of smoke coming off of these fires in Northern California and pushing it up into Southern Oregon under these kind of strong southwest or moderate southwest winds. That's why you see all this smoke kind of downwind or to the north and east of these ongoing fires. So this is useful for, it only goes out 2 days, but it's kind of useful for, well, we're going to get a big bunch of smoke tomorrow or not. So it's looking like even here in kind of central or Northern California, we're potentially going to be seeing some smoke impacts, which is, I think, about the first time we've had smoke this year, except for some prescribed fires earlier in the spring. All right, so I wanted to just highlight the weather in the weather tool. The reason for that is that this drives everything else here. So the fire modeling tools take as input forecast streams from the HRRR, the High Resolution Rapid Refresh, the NAM, the North American Mesoscale Model, and the GFS, the Global Forecast System, and use that to calculate fuel moistures that then drive fire spread models and risk models. So I'll start with active fires. I'm going to kind of skip over the risk tab for now. And there's a lot going on. This was pretty quiet in California until, was it 2 or 3 days ago now? There was a lightning bust almost 3 years to the date after the 2020 fire siege that ignited lots of very devastating fires across California, LNU complex, SCU complex, et cetera. And as I mentioned, some of these fires haven't been imaged yet, so they aren't mapped all that precisely, but we can still look at some spread potential. I'm going to look at Canyon and Elliott in particular. The northern fire is Elliott, I believe, and the southern fire is Canyon. They've either burned together or will shortly be burning together. And I want to just show real quick the fire history in this area. There's a lot of fire history. There was a lightning bust in 2008 that ignited somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 fires across Northern California. It was a much larger event than what we're seeing out there now, but a lot of this area burned in the complex, or one of the complexes that resulted from that, the Siskiyou complex. There was also the Iron complex, the Lime complex. There was lots of groups of fires. But the area that this fire is burning in hasn't really burned in about 15 years. So there's definitely some potential fuel out there. The way that the model works is it pulls in hotspot data, infrared data, and in some cases, fire guard polygons, and uses that to initialize a fire spread run, meaning where is the fire hot and where is it burning? Or where is it burning and where is it already burned? And so I'm going to just turn off some of these hotspot data layers here. And what we have is purple, and blue. Areas that are purple, as you can see from the legend here, are burning at the start of the forecast. Areas that are blue have already burned, meaning they're black, they've consumed their fuel, and there's an algorithm that figures this out from hotspot data and IR and so on. Then down here at the bottom is a time slider and a tool that allows us to advance things in time. And so this is actually earlier this morning, so why don't we get out here to say 6 p.m. local time. And this will take a moment or two to refresh here. And while that's happening, I'll see if I can get the final perimeter up. There it is. Okay, so what we're looking at is the modeled spread of this fire from this particular starting point. And the way that this is stylized or colorized is to show, essentially the areas that are red or are these brighter colors are actively burning, and then the areas that are gray or black have already burned. And so what I'm going to do here is drag this out to the end of the forecast. We are currently running 14-day fire progressions for these active fires. The models really don't have much predictive capability out to 14 days, but it gives an idea of fire potential. And this is something that the Forest Service is currently using for looking at resource allocation across these fires. So here is the modeled perimeter after 14 days unsuppressed with the fire spread model called Elm Fire. You can see this is getting quite large. And I should point out a couple other things. So in addition to looking at the forecasted fire location, which you can select here, you might be interested in, well, how much of this burns as passive or active crown fire or surface fire. And what you can see here is that these areas that are, kind of yellow, or I don't know, is that orange or light orange or yellow, that is surface fire. And the reason for that, if you turn on fire history, is this area burned relatively recently. I'm going to turn off the fire history layer again. Orange is passive crown fire, which usually means individual trees torching. And then red is active crown fire, which is the surface fire is coupled actively to the crown fire or the canopy fire, and they spread as a contiguous fire front. So that is the crown fire forecast. This is the flame length forecast, which of course is correlated to crown fire. Wherever there's crown fire, we're going to have very high flame lengths, in this case, well above 25 feet, which is why it sort of maxes out the color ramp here. And then last but not least is spread rate. So this is showing how quickly a fire is spreading through a particular area. One of the things you might notice is that under predicted fire size, we have a number of options that can be selected, ranging from the smallest or 10th percentile up to the 90th percentile. And the reason for this is that these forecasts are ensemble forecasts, just the way that weather models, or at least ensemble weather models, operate, is to run several variations of the same basic forecast where the inputs are perturbed. And so we're doing the same thing here. All of these forecasts are ensembles, where you're not just running a single rendition or a single version of the same forecast, but typically 100 to 1,000. This current generation is being run with 100 ensemble members. And so the smallest fire, or the 10th percentile fire, is that's smaller than 90 of those ensemble members. The largest is, there we go, the 90th percentile is larger than 90% or the other 90 ensemble members. And then our kind of middle of the road projection is the 50th percentile, or the median fire size. Okay. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that this system, this whole front end here, is agnostic to the spread model, meaning any spread model can be used here. We're currently using two spread models. One is called Elm Fire. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the second is called Grid Fire. So under model, you can flip over to Grid Fire. And there is the median projection from grid fire. And there is the largest, okay? So this is really just meant to show that whatever new model comes along, if a new model comes along, maybe something that is not a traditional fire model, maybe AI-based or something like that, you know, this system can accommodate that. So we're not really, you know, hanging our hat, so to speak, on any particular model. It's meant to be able to work with multiple models. Okay, so that is a that's just an example of how we're using different models and running them in ensembles and really getting, rather than a single forecast, getting a range of forecasts to account for that uncertainty. You may have heard about, I want to go to another fire. Let me go back to all active fires. You may have heard about this particular fire in the news, at least I did this morning. It's called the Head Fire. And this is a fire burning, unlike the Canyon and Elliott fire, which isn't really near much of anything. This is burning in some area where there's actually structures. So we can turn on the structures layer, and you get an idea from the fire polygons and as well as the hotspot data where this fire is and that it's burning near some structures. So this particular fire will probably be suppressed more heavily or more readily than the other fire that we were just looking at. But what you can see is it's also in pretty rough terrain. You know, there's a lot of steep slopes here. There's you know, drainages. It's really really kind of mountainous, rough country. Okay. So let's take a look at the modeled spread for this particular fire. Let me turn off this modeled perimeter. I'm going to just clean things up a little bit here. Bear with me. And okay. All right, looks like it's taking a minute to load. But the main thing I want to show here is the difference between a suppressed fire and an unsuppressed fire. One of the really cool things that we're just now working on this fire season is modeling fires in real time, both unsuppressed and with suppression. So I'll keep flame length on. I'll drag this out to the end of the forecast period. So what you're seeing here is flame length, and this red polygon is the ultimate or the final perimeter after 14 days. We're picking up a little bit of spread from this other fire to the south. And if you look under fire name and go down to, if you note all these fires have both an unsuppressed fire, which is just indicated by the state and then the fire name. And then the fire modeled with suppression is that same fire name, but with suppressed tacked on. And so you'll see if we drag this out to the end, this is going to be a much smaller fire perimeter. And this is probably a lot more realistic, frankly, than the unsuppressed fire, because we know that this fire is going to be suppressed because it's close to assets at risk, whereas some of these other fires are not. So this is a really big improvement or enhancement over our previous unsuppressed fire spread modeling, where we're actually now using a spread or a suppression model that mimics the way that firefighters actually contain a fire by going after the slowest spreading parts of the fire first, knocking that down, and then moving on to the more actively spreading parts of the fire. So you can, for all these fires in here, look at both an unsuppressed fire as well as a suppressed fire. And we are in the process of adjusting and tuning the suppression parameters here for both ongoing active fires, meaning forecasts, as well as playing back or reconstructing past fires to understand how to tune the parameters that affect that suppression algorithm. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to show here is if I log in, enter my password and my credentials, one of the things that shows up that is not in the public facing page or site is this match drop tool. And what this does is allow you to select a particular location. Let's pick a location in the Central Valley where there's some flashy fuels, there are cured grasses and so on. And we can pick a particular location that's quite random right there. Give it a name. I'm not particularly creative, so I'll call it webinar, PyreCast webinar. There you go. And then when you click submit, what happens is this is now pulling weather data for that particular location, weather forecast data, and it's running both Elm Fire and Grid Fire, and it's going to generate the same type of outputs that we were looking at for the active fires. And it can take a few minutes in some cases. This is kind of a status of what it's doing. So you can look into the log file. This is a lot of this is really more for diagnostic purposes. But so this just launched a match drop on the cluster. As I said, it's going to take a couple of minutes here. So I don't want to have us sit here and watch this. So I've got some teed up from earlier that I launched earlier this morning. And so to get there, I'm just going to close this. To get there, you can go to the list of active fires. And way down at the bottom, I've got the webinar fire and the webinar 2 fire. As I said, I'm not very creative. And what you can do there is, just as with the active fires, play this forward in time for both. Okay, so here's the 24-hour forecast for that particular fire from Elm Fire, and then here it is from Grid Fire. So this is a real useful tool for things like, I don't know, maybe there's some high winds coming and there's a fire where there's a possibility of having embers go over the line, land on the other side of a containment line, and you want to maybe test what the spread potential is if that were to happen. So there's a lot of use cases for this, but this is a way for authenticated users to essentially be able to ignite fires at a particular point or a particular location at a particular time. And one of the things that's I think kind of cool about this is that this works for both forecast. So you can select a forecast date and time, so ignite it at a particular time. This is the current time, but you can also model historical fires. So there's about 10 years of data, 10 years of historical weather data in here. So if you wanted to ignite a fire back in October of 2017, for example, you can do that and then select, use the calendar to select any date from January 2011 through to, I think we've processed it through the end of last year. So it's useful for, kind of looking at historical ignitions as well. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about this final tab that we haven't gone over yet called risk. And really this is more fire consequence than risk. But what this is doing is igniting about 500 million fires across California over the next 5 days, and then modeling their spread and using that to look at essentially fire potential. How big can fires get? So I like to use the information tool here and query a particular location. And what you'll see, which we're actually not seeing here, is a strong diurnal variation. So let me go to an area where we'll see a little bit more diurnal variation. This isn't the best example, but what this is doing is modeling how big fires can get if they start at a particular location and spread for 6 hours unsuppressed. So in this case, in these flashy fuels, we're seeing fire sizes, 6-hour fire sizes unsuppressed of upwards of 5,000 acres. And you can see that goes out for 5 days, 120 hours. If we go to Southern California, it's a little bit different story because as we had talked about, there's Hurricane Hillary coming. So that's why you see really this empty area here as we go out later in the week. And if we go out to, this is 100 some hours, so that is the 20th, so Sunday. Rain has pushed in, and there's really no potential for fire across much of much of California, at least the southern parts of California. However, in Northern California, which isn't really forecast to get much rain, there's still some significant fire potential. There are other things we can look at. So crown fire area, and I'm going to back up to time before the rain is pushed in. So this is for fires today. So this is showing areas where there is more potential for crown fire, which is of significance because this tends to be fires that are harder to suppress and control. You might wonder, what are these kind of bare spots here? That's not precipitation, but if I turn on the fire history layer, you can see that a lot of this is due to recent fires in 2020, 2021, and 2022. There's a couple other things we can look at. So if we go to, I'm just going to log out here and get back to risk. Okay, there we go. That's better. So back to where we were, fire area and fire volume, which is an integral, or the spatial integral of fire area with flame length. I talked about crown fire area, but the one I want to point out is impacted structures. So what this is doing is igniting fires under historical patterns of fire ignition using the fire occurrence database. So there's a spatial and a temporal component to it. And it's then looking at areas where if a fire starts, it's more likely to impact structures. So we can go out to, I don't know, why don't we go to find an area where there's some potential impacts. And this one looks good. All right, so what this is showing is for fire starting, this would be tomorrow at about 2 p.m. Fire starting in this area have the potential to impact around 100 structures. Impact does not mean destroy. It's just a tally of the number of structures within the fire perimeter. And we can dial back the opacity, maybe turn on the satellite street layer. And so you can see this is kind of a classic wildland urban interface area where you have structures interspersed with vegetation and so on. And bring that opacity up. Again, we can also look at, again, this relative burn probability, which is showing the potential for certain areas to be burned relative to others. And again, it's based on both fire spread, but also fire occurrence. So more fires being ignited in areas where there's been more fires historically, and then the fuel moistures and wind and so on control where those fires go and spread. Okay. So this is really looking at fire potential and potential impacts to assets at risk, in particular structures. This being a project funded by the Energy Commission, we are also looking at fires ignited by power lines, not just in California, but across much of the Western US. So I'll turn on the transmission lines layer, and what you can see here is that anywhere where we have these reds and greens, those are areas that are in the current model or in the current extent of the current model. And this is a very similar analysis to the all-cause fires layers that I was just showing, except the ignitions are constrained to underneath power lines, okay? In particular, transmission lines. So this is showing how fires are moving off of these power lines. This is up in Oregon, moving into California, more typical westerly spread here. And this is useful for looking at how big fires can get in a few hours. This is a 6-hour burn period, as well as impacts to potential structures. So if I turn on fire area, turn off the overhead line layer. So what this is doing is essentially coloring these transmission lines according to the size of the fires that result at a particular point in the future. So this is for fires ignited tomorrow at about 4 p.m. Pacific. And this is showing potential for 2,000 acres off of these lines here. And if we turn on the relative burn probability layer, which is what we were looking at before, you can kind of see how those fires are moving off of those lines. One that is very important for public safety power shutoff is the number of impacted structures. And so let's find an area. It looks like we don't have a whole lot of areas where there's big problems or big potential because there really isn't much wind. But let's pick an area here. So this is showing the potential for 60 structures to be impacted. And again, impacted does not mean destroyed. It just means within the modeled fire perimeter within the first 6 hours of spread. So there's all our structures. And then we can go to relative burn probability, and you can see that's showing these, basically fire moving into these areas where structures are. Okay. So that is a quick overview of the risk tool. As I said, authenticated users, utilities can have their proprietary and confidential assets in here and then run this same type of analysis for their assets and data, in addition to being able to run match drop forecasts and things like that. Okay, so I think that's the main things I wanted to cover here in the demo. I'm going to skip over a lot of these slides just in the interest of time, but I do want to cover some of the things here. So the everything that I just showed is open source. So for example, if you want to have a look at the Elmfire spread model, it's elmfire.io. This shows how to install and set up that particular model. There is some basic tutorials that show how to set up and run, in this case, a real simple spread from north to south. It gives this elliptical fire spread shape. This is under a transient wind. This is using real world fuels. This is landscape scale fire potential. If we go back to, I've got to get out of here, back to PowerPoint. There we go. There's also GitHub repository for Elmfire for grid fire. There we go. For grid fire, this is the open source GitHub repository. Grid fire is a literate program. This explains what a literate program is and gives some basic steps for setting it up and running some samples. The PyreCast web application, which is basically all the website, that is all also open source. It's under the Pyregence /Pyregence, and walks through, I guess first it explains that it's currently configured to work with both Elmfire and GridFire, talks about the installation requirements, how to configure the application, set up a database. The idea here is that this allows other users to really come in and start making changes to, contributing to, using these open source repositories. And then the GeoSync repository is what essentially connects the outputs from the fire model to the web map. It takes outputs and gets them into a geo server, which is then what serves up all the data to the web application. So in addition to the software being open source and available, the data is also served up a couple different ways here, and I'm going to get that window out of the way. So the PyreCast web application is pyrecast.org. That's what we were looking at earlier. There is a web server that is a real simple way to obtain all the data, the raw underlying native format file data for the things that are displayed in PyreCast. So if you go to fire spread forecast, these are all the forecasts that are in the system. There's about, at last check, between 55 and 60 separate forecasts. Yesterday, there were about 425 forecasts issued. And so if you want to download the underlying data, you could go to, I don't know, let's pick the Titus fire, for example. So here is a forecast from earlier this morning. And here are the GeoTIFF files for spread rate. So you could write a script to basically pull these in, and you have now the underlying data that is used in the PyreCast web application. Okay, so all of the forecast data, all the risk data, all the weather data lands on this web server, and so we have some users that are pulling this in, archiving it, doing different things with it. In addition to the forecast data, there's all the fuels and topography data, all the land fire layers. All this is public domain. This is a little bit of a cumbersome way to access the data. So in addition to the web server, if I close this here, get back to the presentation, there is an API that allows you to pull in. Actually, there's a couple APIs. One allows you to pull in the active fire data, and the other allows you to pull in basically everything else. We have it split up over a couple different geo servers. And so this URL, if you go to Trinity, trinity.pyregence.org/geoserver/web, which is this URL here, you'll see this page. And what you want to do typically is, if you click on this WMS, that's a web map service. This is an API that allows pre-styled layers to be added to different applications. I'm just going to copy that URL to the, or that link address to the clipboard. And then I'm going to come over here into QGIS, if I can figure out how to do that. Oh, I know why. I have to exit PowerPoint. There we go. Too many windows. All right, so I just copied that URL. I am now going into QGIS, which is a general purpose GIS software. It's what we use here internally. A lot of folks use Esri. This also works with Esri products as well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a WMS, a web map service layer. And I've already sort of, well, here, let me see if I can just show how this works from the beginning. So I'm going to say new. I'm going to give it a URL. That's the URL that I just copied from the clipboard. I'm going to call this active fires. Okay. And then I'm going to click connect. And so now what it's doing, you can see here, is it's QGIS is saying to the geo server, it's saying, hey, what layers do you have there? What are your capabilities? What data can you give me? And there's a lot of data in the system now, so it's going to take a little bit of a while for that to load. Looks like it just did. And so these are all the available layers that are served up by that geo server that can be pulled in by this API. We looked at the canyon fire earlier. So let's see if we can get some of the same data that we were looking at in PyreCast into QGIS here. So if we go to, I think this is what we want: elm fire, land fire, 50th percentile hours since burned. I've just selected that. It's going to sit here and think for a bit because it has to figure out how to get all that data. I'm going to go add. And this will sit here. And so what it's doing is it's pulling in the fire progression data for the canyon fire hourly. So 24 hours a day times 14 days, whatever that works out to. It's 300 and some odd hourly layers. It looks like that's just landed. And so here we now have the canyon fire data in QGIS. And the cool thing about this is it's time aware. So I can go back in time. So here we are, and you can see the time down here at the bottom. So this is 8:18 at 9:17. That's going to be UTC. So that's when this particular forecast was initialized. And then it responds to this time slider. And so it's going out in time. All right, so this is a real simple, easy way to pull data from PyreCast into GIS and make maps. So you don't have to screenshot anything. You don't have to download those files from the web server, although you're certainly welcome to. You can just use this API to pull in all kinds of data. Basically, everything that's in PyreCast is available by API and can be pulled into this type of application, any type of a GIS application. Okay, so kind of back to the presentation here. This is the stuff I said I'm going to skip over. I don't want to get bogged down in math, but I do want to talk a little bit about our kind of ongoing research and progress, some of the things we've accomplished recently, some of the things we're currently working on, and what our goals are for the near-term future. So as I pointed out, all the source code that powers PyreCast is now in public GitHub repositories. We welcome you to check it out, have a look, let us know if you come across anything that looks like a bug, for example, which we hope there's not, but if you've done software development, you know that those things often crop up. We've made a really concerted effort to improve documentation, tutorials, and test cases. So you can see some of this at the elmfire.io site, as well as GridFire's GitHub repository. We've added suppression models to both Elmfire and GridFire, and those are being tested in both forecast mode as well as hindcast mode. A really, I think, cool enhancement is that Elmfire and soon GridFire has been coupled to high split, which is a model for smoke dispersion. So we have used this in conjunction with our work with the First Street Foundation to look at smoke impacts. This is done to date as a hindcast, basically a backward-looking analysis. We have plans to extend that to a forecast for next quote-unquote fire season. A big development that I'll talk about here in a little bit is that an urban spread model has been implemented in Elmfire. So the wildfire models that we're using are wildfire models. They actually don't model spread in structures. So something like the Lahaina fire in Maui simply cannot be modeled with current generation wildfire models. The fire would spread up to those structures, and then it would just stop at those structures because they're marked as non-burnable in the inputs. And so one of the things that we're working on is taking some of the learnings from fire protection engineering and structure fires and synthesizing that with wildland fire and having that form the basis for the spread projections in areas where there's structures, as opposed to using the wildfire spread model. There's some that goes along with a change to the way that spotting is treated from burning structures, so that's being enhanced. And then something that's a relatively recent development is really a focus on APIs and microservices to facilitate remote execution of Elmfire and GridFire. So basically make a call to an API and launch an Elmfire or GridFire run, similar to what I showed in match drop, but from the command line. And with a REST API, which has been built, this allows these models to be plugged into other applications. Any model that can, or any application that can make an API call can be used to trigger an Elmfire or a GridFire fire spread run. Okay, so that's some of our recent progress. As far as what's ongoing, we have a collaboration in progress with UC Berkeley, in particular Michael Gollner's laboratory, as well as the University of Maryland with Arnaud Trouvé. And this is funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. So thank you to the Moore Foundation. And this has to do with development of this urban spread model, or for modeling fires in wildland urban interface, and its implementation into Elmfire, improving the spotting algorithm. And there's also some work being done with the CAL FIRE damage inspection data for model validation purposes. Another collaboration is with UC San Diego and the San Diego Supercomputer Center. You may be familiar with FireMap that was developed by Ilke Altintas et al. And what we're doing there, or here, is taking the same APIs that I mentioned before and using them to essentially plug these spread models into FireMap. So FireMap is currently using Farsight, has some initial attack capabilities, and what we've done is develop containerized implementations of Elmfire and GridFire. So this runs in a Kubernetes cluster or a Kubernetes environment, and this is being used to essentially plug these models into FireMap. With UC Irvine and Jim Randerson's lab there, with the same API and microservices tools, we have developed a way that allows others to conduct verification and validation exercises. So what Jim Randerson's group has done is develop some really cool techniques to generate high resolution, both spatially and temporally, of past fires, fire lines from historical fires. And not being fire modeling experts, they now have the ability to run these models remotely and use that for model verification and validation. It's really helping us out quite a lot. Another collaboration with MITRE involves transcoding the underlying spread models to Python. They're written in different languages, but everything is really moving toward Python. This is really going to help with AI, and what MITRE is interested in particular is development of an AI-based suppression algorithm that will then get fed back in to these repositories. And our work with the First Street Foundation has been ongoing for a couple of years now. I mentioned previously wildfire being coupled to high split for smoke modeling. We're working on improved Monte Carlo formalism for annualized burn probability modeling, and then massively parallel deployments on cloud computing like AWS, where we're talking about running not just hundreds or thousands of cores, but across millions of cores. So these are some of the ongoing collaborations. I wanted to just show real quickly what the some of the kind of early work from the urban spread model is looking like. This is a model, a hindcast or a past cast of the Tubbs fire. This is the Coffee Park neighborhood that was burned almost completely. And so if you try to model this with a current generation model, because those areas are marked as non-burnable in land fire, the model basically runs up to that and stops. And then here we are with the urban spread model that's being tested, where we're actually able to burn through those areas using some of these fire protection engineering and structure fire dynamics principles that I mentioned earlier. And so these are the goals for next season, although we're not even done with 2023 yet. We're already thinking about 2024. The recent fires in Maui, as well as the fires in Canada last year, have really emphasized that we need to extend this to Alaska and Hawaii. So that's sort of at the top of the list. I think the Canada fires this year, the Canadian fires this year, have made a strong case that it would be really helpful to have this type of automated forecasting for Canada. The thing that's stopping us there is we don't have any fuel inputs for Canada. We only have US-based fuel inputs. And so we're looking at how we can maybe get around that with crosswalking or something like that and expand this or extend this to Canada. I mentioned we've done backward-looking smoke modeling with high split. We're looking to extend that to real time. We are in the process of testing the suppression models for active fires. We want to get that dialed in and then have calibrated suppressed fires available in PyreCast as well. I mentioned the urban spread model. We want to get that implemented basically wall to wall and use that for both active fires as well as risk forecasting. And then there's a couple of things that I haven't even mentioned. There's a diurnal burn period, which has to do with fires essentially going to sleep at night and then waking up in the morning. They usually do that, but not always. We need to get a little bit better at how we handle that. There's another phenomenon that models are also not very good at, and that is rekindle. So if you look at a lot of the fires ongoing in Idaho and Montana, they got rained on about 10 days ago, or maybe closer to 2 weeks ago now. They went dormant for a week or 10 days, and they're now burning again because they weren't suppressed. They're essentially allowed to rekindle, but our models are not very good at predicting or forecasting when that rekindle will occur after fires get rained on. And then a couple other things, which is just really adding more data to PyreCast, which is incorporation of the GOES 16 and 17 fire detection products, which shows at roughly 2 kilometer resolution and 5-minute spatial resolution where fires are, and weather station observations. It would be really great to have real-time weather station observations in PyreCast. So those are some of the things that we've established as goals for next year. And as soon as we get out of this fire season, we'll start working on those. So those are the main things I wanted to cover today. Thank you for your attention, and we have some time for question and answer or general discussion. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Chris, I just wanted to ask you if you wanted to show the suppressed version of the model outputs for active fire. Is that something you want to demonstrate today, or so they are in the queue? Or am I putting you on the spot?
I did show that
Oh, you
for
did?
the
Okay.
for the head fire. Yeah.
Okay, I
Um,
must have been spacing out on chat window.
That's okay.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. No worries. Yeah. So I have not looked at the chat. Are there any questions in the chat that need to be answered, or are there any questions from the audience?
Gary, myself, and Megan have been trying to answer questions in the chat. I'm wondering if there's anybody online that doesn't feel that we've sufficiently responded to those questions in the chat. Please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away.
Well, I guess you guys must have done a good job at answering all those questions.
I think a lot of the questions, Chris, this is Gary speaking now. A lot of the questions coming in mostly had to do with sort of frequency of data updates. So there were questions about how frequently is the weather data updated, how frequently is the fuels data updated, or can we, would this system be capable of running with a higher resolution weather product, or sorry, fuel data sets, like the 10 meters that you were talking about before, things like that. I think that's what a lot of it was. Shane provided a pretty extensive listing or sort of copy of the sort of weather data updates and fuels updates in terms of how frequently the various models are updated, like GFS or NBM, HER, et cetera, taking it from the info pages or
Sure.
the info pop-ups on the site. Is there anything you think you'd want to add on top of that?
Yeah, I mean, the weather models are every 6 hours. Now, there are some models like the HER and the NBM that update every hourly, but we're for our cadence, 6 hours is sufficient. So, new forecast data every 6 hours, and there's a rolling archive. We keep about I can't remember if it's 2 or 3 days in the data archive for download and for pulling in through GeoServer. We have done some modeling with 10-meter fuels in the past. Models run a little bit slower, or actually quite a lot slower, but I think for a lot of the kind of wildland areas, 30 meters is probably sufficient. I think where we really need finer resolution or better resolution is in the wildland urban interface, because if you think about a 30-meter pixel, that's 100 foot by 100 foot. You could have 2 houses and 2 sheds or something in that single pixel. So having a little bit higher resolution, I think, is more of an advantage in the wildland urban interface than it is in the kind of wilderness areas.
We
Here's
have
a
a
couple
couple new questions in the chat, starting with Sarah Lindberg, who asked, what is the temporal resolution for the forecast? Are they all the same for propagation and flame length?
So the input data is at 30 meters and it's on a grid, and the output data, or the computational domain, is the same resolution. So for 30-meter inputs, we're outputting at 30-meter resolution. For 10-meter inputs, we would be outputting at 10-meter resolution. We've experimented with running at a little bit finer resolution. There's no reason you can't run like with a 10-meter computational grid using 30-meter inputs, but it really doesn't provide that much of an advantage. It just takes longer and takes more memory. So really, it's a function of the underlying inputs, the spatial resolution of the outputs.
The temporal resolution, so mostly that's hourly, and I guess there are some weather forecasts that is every 15 minutes.
Yeah, there's the HER has a sub-hourly product that is every 15 minutes. The RTMA, real-time mesoscale analysis, has an hourly product, and it also has a sub-hourly product as well. So there are some meteorological products down to around 15 minutes, I think, is the highest temporal resolution that I'm aware of, at least.
I was flagging in the chat that with respect to the fire behavior forecasts and the risk forecasts, those are set with a temporal resolution of 1 hour, but the extent varies between the risk and the
There's another question, as you mentioned, FireGuard polygons. Is that a form that form the National Guard? That's Daniel Marker. You can unmute yourself, Daniel. I don't know, maybe you can, Chris, you can just talk about FireGuard a little bit. Chris, did you want to talk about FireGuard? Oh, shoot. Okay, sorry about that. You guys good? I think I muted everybody.
Thank you, Shane.
Okay, that's better.
Sorry about that.
Not only did you mute everybody, but you wouldn't let us come off of
Okay,
off
thought I
of
was
mute.
unmuting everybody.
Yeah, so yeah, in terms of the real-time data that flows into this, there is the National Incident Feature Service, which is what provides the IR polygons. There's Modus and VIIRS, and then there's also FireGuard. We use FireGuard primarily to get fire names in real time, although we have experimented around using some of the polygons. There's or at least we found for this year, there's a lot of false detections in the FireGuard work, so we're not currently using that. That's a proprietary product that we were able to get access to through our work with the U.S. Forest Service, but we're currently using it in PyreCast only for bringing in fire names and not building fire initialization polygons from it. Hope that answers the question.
And then there's a question here, what kind of spotting improvements were added to elm fire?
This work is being led by a PhD student at University of Maryland, Yurin Kim. And what he is looking at is how to better account for spotting from burning structures, because structures have a very different spotting profile than wildland fuels. And the spotting models in elm fire and grid fire are based around wildland fuels. So it is and that's why that work is linked really to the urban spread model. There's a couple things. One, we want to generate a lot more embers and treat them more stochastically. And currently we're using a Lagrangian approach, which means tracing particles, tracking individual particles. That doesn't scale really well. But if you think about a wind field, it's Eulerian, meaning on a grid. And so we're actually looking at using an Eulerian spotting model in elm fire because it's much more computationally efficient and scalable than using a Lagrangian approach. So those are some of the enhancements that are being added to elm fire. And you can see some of the work in the pull requests from Yurin if you go to the elm fire repo and look at recent pull requests.
Great. And then Tim Bailey, if you want to jump on, he has a question. Have you considered varying the intensity of effort between suppressed and unsuppressed?
Sorry, what was have you considered mirroring? Was that the word?
Considering varying the varying intensity of effort between suppressed and unsuppressed.
I think if I understand the question, I think what it's getting at is that there might be different degrees of suppression. So some fires are more heavily suppressed than others. And a fire burning in the wilderness, for example, is likely not going to be suppressed, whereas a fire burning in the wildland urban interface, your structures would likely be heavily suppressed. Yeah, that's kind of what I was alluding to or talking about earlier with regard to calibration, is that there is a little bit of calibration that has to be done. We're using a suppression difficulty index as a metric for identifying where fires should be more readily suppressed than others. But there are other factors that play into this, in particular things beyond suppression difficulty, like protecting assets at risk and things like that. So suppression is a real a challenging area of fire modeling. It has not received nearly as much attention as the fire, the fire model algorithms and subroutines themselves. But if you look at a lot of the fires, suppression is just as an important piece for explaining why those fires end up with the final perimeter that they do, as the underlying suppression or spread models are.
And Mason asks, can you talk about your advancements in handling large plume-driven I and PyroCB fires?
Yeah, we don't handle large pyrocumulus-driven fires because the models that we're using here are uncoupled models. They're not the right tool for that type of model. For that, you would want to use something like Janice Cohn's model, Coffee, which has those dynamics. So one of the things that we've been looking at and thinking about is how to maybe use a scaled down implementation of fire atmosphere coupling for plume dominated fires. But in general, the uncoupled models like elm fire and grid fire, uncoupled meaning they're not coupled to the atmosphere, they take the meteorology as a boundary condition. Those don't do a very good job with plume dominated fires. In fact, we had a paper that was published, I think last year, about the creek fire, the 2020 creek fire, which was a very plume dominated fire. And we showed that the operational uncoupled models just don't do a very good job at that. So that's an area where there's definitely some research needed to maybe bridge the gap between the full computational fluid dynamics based models like Coffee and the operational uncoupled models like elm fire and grid fire that run very quickly.
And Joanne Fights wants to know when we're going to pull in Coffee, the Janice Cohen's model.
We've been working on it for a couple of years, and it's in the works. We've had a couple starts and stops on that. We just need a few quiet months to make good progress where we're not kind of doing the day-to-day care and feeding of where we are now. But yeah, Coffee is something we've been working on with Janice and getting Coffee added to PyreCast. It's a challenge because it takes a very different set of inputs than the operational models do. It needs upper air data, it needs 3D weather data, and it's a much more, an order of magnitude more involved effort to get that running operationally and in an automated way than it is for the uncoupled models. But it's definitely on the radar screen.
Great. That is all the questions that I'm seeing in the chat board. If
We
there's
had
anybody.
one more follow-up question from Sarah
Okay.
on the temporal resolution. Is there any way of knowing when was the last update for the weather variables forecast we are using in the layers? You mentioned it can be between 6 hours and 15 minutes.
So a couple of things. The forecast cycle is selectable from a drop down under weather. So you can select today's 12Z forecast or today's 6Z forecast for the weather itself. And then for the fire forecasts, the system is set up to use the most recent or the most timely complete forecast data that's available. So as soon as the 12Z forecast becomes available, the spread models will use that. As soon as the 18Z forecast becomes available, the spread or risk models will use that, and so on. So it's constantly using the the latest and greatest data as it comes in on kind of a rolling basis.
All right.
That's all the questions.
Unless anybody wants to unmute themselves, if there's anything else, we can try to get out of here.
There's a question. Can you give a synopsis of the difference in your models versus Farsight?
Yeah, so I'm most familiar with elm fire, Gary. So if you want to talk about grid fire, maybe we could
Sure.
tag team this one a little bit. So elm fire is basically a gridded version of Farsight at a simple level. It uses the same length to width ratio or length to width factors as a function of wind speed that Farsight does. It produces the same elliptical fire shapes as Farsight does in idealized terrain. Some of the differences are just some of the more recent things that I talked about. So suppression modeling, smoke coupling, some of the spotting treatment is much different, the urban spread model. And also these models are designed to run on massively parallel compute resources. So it's significantly faster, not necessarily because of the underlying algorithm per se, but because it's built to leverage MPI, message passing interface, and distributed memory parallelization. But at a simple level, I often describe wildfire as sort of a close to a gridded implementation of Farsight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, over on the grid fire side, there's a lot of similarities with wildfire and Farsight again. A lot of the initial testing or design and build was based on an earlier model from UC Berkeley called H-Fire. And that was also tested against Farsight and got quite similar parameters in the publications around it. And we've done a good bit of testing against Behave Plus outputs and Flam Map in terms of trying to look at general perimeter shapes and spread rates, flame length, and so on and so forth on a cell-by-cell basis on a raster grid. But grid fire, like Elmfire, is another gridded fire spread model, whereas Farsight and Flame Map's MTT algorithm are vector-based. So they track the movement, or they track the expansion of a dissecting and expanding perimeter of nodes for the fire shape as it expands out, and then they have to track it in a finite amount of memory. So as the fire shape becomes more finely dissected along the edge, as the fire spreads or just becomes larger, Farsight has to go through a step of perimeter culling. So if it's using, let's say, 1,000 points to track the perimeter edge, and it exceeds its limit of 1,000 points on the next time step and needs 1,050, Farsight has to go through and clip off 50 points or more and try to slightly simplify the edge so it can keep it within its fixed memory. And that culling step is one of the things that slows it down and allows models like Elmfire, Gridfire to go a little bit quicker because they're just working with data on a raster grid. So as they're spreading, they're just tracking the cells that are being manipulated onside the grid, as opposed to a growing or shrinking number of nodes on a polygon perimeter, something like that. But the underlying, as Chris said, the underlying equations like the Rothermel surface fire spread models, the Van Wagner crowning equations, the Cruz crown spreading models, Schroeder for spotting models, and so on and so forth, should be shared with Farsight and Flame Map and so on.
One more question here. Why not use Irwin for fire data?
We do. That's how things are tracked internally, but we don't want every fire that shows up in Irwin, with an Irwin ID in the system, because most of them are real small. So that's why we use FireGuard for getting fire names, because those are usually things that are on the order of tens of acres. So there's a fine line to walk between including every fire, even the 0.01 or the 0.1 acre fires in the system, and those that are actively spreading. So, but Irwin is used internally for updating acreages. If you look in PyreCast, you'll see acreage and containment, and that all comes from Irwin. So it's a little bit of a hybrid.
Not seeing anything else in the chat board, although Joanne thanks us for or looks forward to the atmospheric coupling edition. I think we all are.
we all are, yeah.
Right. Any concluding remarks, Chris?
No, I just wanted to thank everybody for attending. Hope it wasn't too long or technical. I try to keep it pretty high level, and if there's any questions, please follow up by email. We'd be happy to do our best to answer your questions. And yeah, again, thank you for your attention. Really appreciate you taking some time out of your Friday afternoon.
Yeah, and just again, we'll be basically we have recorded this webinar, and we'll be posting it to our media page on the Pyregence website. I think I posted that in the chat board here. We'll have a follow-up email as well with all the people that have participated, and so we'll just make sure you get that link and you can share it with your colleagues. And thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.